So we now turn to chapter 2, and this is a really important chapter. Obviously, the corresponding lecture also very important. A lot of the developments we're going to look at here, kind of laying the foundation for much of what we're going to look at with the ensuing chapters. So, if you get this stuff down, you'll be really well placed as far as material that we're going to be covering later on. So this chapter, you see the heading there, Four Great Revolutions. We're talking about revolutions in thinking, in ideas. In this case, corresponding either to religion or philosophy. Though I do want to make the point that historically, until you get to the modern period, and by modern period I mean, even let's say as late as the 19th century, throughout much of history, we don't really see this kind of strong distinction between what today we call philosophy versus religion. So there's a lot of overlap there. So I kind of want, we should be mindful of that because we're kind of looking at developments early on. And in the modern period, we have a tendency to compartmentalize these things as being entirely distinct, but that hasn't always been the case. So we're going to look at four great revolutions. The first one corresponding to Chinese philosophy, the second, Indian religion, the third, Judaic monotheism, the belief in one God, Judaism generally being considered the earliest purely monotheistic faith, and finally, developments related to Greek philosophy. Now, what's really interesting is we find a lot of commonalities, kind of similar elements with respect to all four developments that we're going to look at. And what's kind of, for me, what I find really fascinating is that we have no historical evidence of borrowing from one tradition to the other. So in some cases, we find certain developments that, in a very, very specific and detailed way, are quite similar, to the point where you'd almost be encouraged to imagine that the one religious or philosophical tradition had borrowed this element from another. But we have no evidence of that. As far as we can tell, based on the historical evidence, pretty much the developments we're looking at here are all happening independently of one another. So the commonalities that we find, the similarities. Number one, all revolutions occurred around river valley civilizations. So we have these kind of very well-developed civilizations already in place. All the necessary material preconditions for that, usually kind of agricultural based economically, strong hierarchy, all the things that we talked about connected with early civilizations. Number two, each transformation that we're going to look at was born of a breakdown in the old social order. There was some kind of societal crisis, and the old answers weren't working, and this led to a new vision of the social and political order. Number three, breakthroughs and advances occurred within the original tradition, right? So they're kind of building on what was already there. They're not inventing something entirely new in all of these cases, right? And so, when we kind of look at these developments, we'll try to think about, what elements of what was already in place are being utilized and then built upon. Number four, the spread of cultures came from the original heartlands of these philosophies, religions, right? So, pretty much in each case, the starting point, for instance, with respect to Chinese philosophy, is kind of the point of origin for what had existed prior. And, again, it's not that something is coming from, externally from outside and displacing what was already there. This kind of corresponds to the idea that it's building on what was already there. And finally, number five, cultural patterns endured. One set, after these changes had kind of played out, whatever was now in place was very resistant to other cultural patterns, rarely displaced, right? So, in the case of Indian religions, it's going to be like you do have actually at some point the introduction of an entirely new religion, Islam, but that kind of development is going to be rare, and even in that case is going to incorporate many elements of what was already in place within Indian society, right, in terms of how Islam is practiced in India. So these kind of new cultural patterns really become quite fixed in some ways. we're going to start with developments with respect to Chinese philosophy, and we might begin more or less where we left off in our discussion of China, that Zhou society had disintegrated, and there was a desire to reunify China. It had become politically fragmented, and so there's this kind of search for new principles that could recreate a peaceful society, and this leads to the period of the 100 schools. And we already mentioned this, right? And by schools, we mean schools of thought, right? Kind of different philosophical approaches for how to achieve this peaceful society. And the focus is very often going to be on government. Now, in terms of Chinese philosophy, this is a good example of where we have to be careful not to compartmentalize philosophy versus religion as if they are two entirely distinct things. And in fact, one of the readings that we're going to have dealing with Confucianism is going to examine the relationship between, kind of what today we'd call religious thought versus philosophy, right? So in any event, at some point, so you have these 100 schools, promoting different philosophical approaches. Eventually, one philosophy will emerge and become dominant, and obviously, that is going to be Confucianism. We should note, though, that alongside with that development, we start to see the emergence of a Chinese cosmology. So right here, we see an example of this kind of religious dimension with respect to Chinese philosophy, right? They developed this kind of, perception of reality that involves a cosmos made up of two parts, heaven and earth. But this is where if you're coming at this from a quote-unquote Western perspective, you have to be very careful. We tend to see heaven and earth as two kind of distinct opposite entities, right? And that is not how the Chinese saw it. They saw it as a single continuous entity and as non-dualistic. It's not earth versus heaven. They're not opposites. They're somehow integrated into a whole, into a continuous whole. And remember, the term cosmology kind of refers to how a people perceive the nature of reality, the nature of the universe, but also the nature of human existence, right? And so, for human beings, what you're seeking is to harmonize the various cosmological forces involved, right? So that heaven and earth are, kind of in harmony with one another. And the way that you do this is through ritual. Ritual is very important. And this is not unlike what we saw with respect to the religious practices of early civilizations. But also they developed this idea that it is through virtue, right? Right living, right behavior, right thought, and so forth. Now, it was exactly into this environment that a fellow named Confucius was born. So Confucius, what do we know about him historically? We have to be careful here. Much of what we think we know about him comes from Confucian tradition. So it is what we call an interested source. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, but we talked about this a bit with the, kind of the story of Exodus, the fact that the only accounts we have of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt are biblical ones. So it's kind of similar here, right? The accounts of Confucius are more concerned with teaching certain values and principles related to Confucianism versus, just giving a kind of journalistic account of who he was and what his life was like. But what do we know about him? Probably lived between 551 479 BCE, born of the lower nobility in northeastern China. And essentially, probably, the best description of him is that he was a teacher who traveled from state to state and picked up disciples, followers, who then eventually would carry on his teachings. His primary concern was to find a ruler who would put his ideas into practice to create the perfect government that would reunify China and create the ideal peaceful society. And he never succeeded. He basically died failing to find a ruler whom he might advise. He never found anyone, either who wanted him or he felt was had the right potential in this regard. And, during his life, many of his ideas were considered impractical, but they would have a major impact over the ensuing centuries. So, some basic ideas about Confucianism. He presented his ideas as really preserving the old ways, but this was mostly by kind of creating a myth about early Zhou society that it somehow constituted a golden age. And then kind of constructing, our understanding of Zhou society as somehow being this kind of perfect society, and then asking, well, how did they achieve that? What was the secret of its success, right? And so this became the purpose of whatever he was teaching was how do we recreate that kind of perfect society, the golden age. And related to this, we might say his teaching constituted various sayings, right? Things that he would tell his disciples by way of helping them understand, what it meant to govern in the proper way. And these sayings would eventually be collected by his disciples and came to constitute what might be called the holy book of Confucianism, the Analects. Right? So this is the core text of Confucianism. This is your starting point, and pretty much everything in the Analects attributed to Confucius. It came to have the authority of, we might almost say, a sacred text. So, what are the core principles that Confucius taught? Right. So first of all, again, using this kind of mythical conception of Zhou society as kind of a model of what we're supposedly striving for, right? He came up with what he called kind of this idea that they had an aristocracy that lived by a code, right? And that kind of underlied their success as a society. And we need to take that old aristocratic code and then, based on that, create a new ethical system that any educated Chinese could practice, right? So we're kind of like expanding this code to include everyone, but it will be probably most relevant to those individuals serving in government, right? The essence of this old aristocratic code might be summed up by one term, junci, which probably the best translation for that term would be of noble behavior, right? A person with the inner virtues of humanity, integrity, righteousness, altruism, and loyalty, right? I mean, so that someone who cultivates these inner virtues so that they come to define how he or she behaves, right? I think we're familiar with most of these terms. I mean, humanity, the ability to empathize with other individuals, right? The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That actually comes from Confucianism, by the way. The idea that you don't do certain things to people because you wouldn't like it if someone did it to you. You don't hit someone because you know how it feels to be hit, right? And you wouldn't like it if someone did it to you. You don't steal from someone, right? Because you would be very, very upset if someone stole something from you. Integrity, right? Another way of thinking that, that you behave in a very honest manner, right? Everything about your behavior conveys the kind of person you are. Nothing is secret. Righteousness, well, behaving in a right manner, behaving in a fair way, in a just way, and so forth. Altruism, that would be kind of the opposite of being greedy, where you're willing to make sacrifices for the common good or for the benefit of another individual. And loyalty, I think we all know what that means. Now, this code should apply to everyone. And for Confucius, everything is defined ultimately by relationships, right? So if you're asking how should someone behave, well, you have to contextualize it with respect to someone else. How should you behave as a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband? How should you behave as a brother to a sister or a sister to a brother? And most importantly, how should you behave as a son to a father or a father to a son, right? So, I mean, if he were giving specific examples of, what constitutes junci, noble behavior, he would always express it in terms of these basic relationships. And in fact, today, when we think of Confucianism, this is probably what we think about first and foremost. But in Confucius' time, probably what he was especially concerned about was the behavior of people in government with respect to those over whom they govern, right? Bureaucrats, right? The people who work in government And if they exhibited junci of noble behavior, then you will have good government. And government really depended on appointing such persons, right? And, in addition to, executing fair, just government that looks out for the welfare of the people, such individuals would serve as examples for the quote unquote masses. And so, Confucianism, by the way, very hierarchical, right? I mean, really, a lot of these ideas about how you behave in relationship is also reflects the idea of knowing your place within the structure. At the top would be the king, the emperor, the sage king, sage meaning ideally a very wise individual. And subjects should behave very respectfully to their king. Subjects also should be respectful towards government bureaucrats. Sons should respect their fathers, wives should respect their husbands, and so forth, right? So he really stressed the importance of hierarchy. And finally, we should note that for Confucius, ritual was very important, right? So this kind of ties into this cosmology that we mentioned before, this kind of continuous entity incorporating heaven and earth. And this might be the more religious dimension, right? Very often these rituals would have no kind of obvious purpose, in terms of kind of functional purpose, but they were very important to him, that they be carried out in exactly the correct way. Confucianism doesn't die with Confucius, of course, and will continue to develop, beginning with his disciples and then subsequent generations, particularly as it becomes more and more important. During the Han Dynasty, in fact, it becomes the official philosophy of China, the official philosophy of government, and remains so pretty much up until the 20th century. And so you're going to have a lot of different thinkers who are going to build on what Confucius started, developing his ideas further and so forth. And very often centering on particular questions, related to kind of, what is expected in terms of human behavior. So one question that becomes very prominent early on has to do with human nature, whether humans are inherently good or bad. We might begin discussion of that with a fellow named Mencius. He argued that humans tend towards the good, that they're inherently good, they have a moral will, just like heaven. So the question then is how do you draw that goodness out, right? Governments have an obligation to cultivate this innate goodness through education, right? This is how you create the perfect, the just society, and so forth. And that is ultimately the primary responsibility of government. And this ends up getting kind of tied into this earlier concept that we looked at, the mandate of heaven, right? If a government fails in this regard, heaven will withdraw its mandate to rule. On the other side of the debate will be a fellow named Junci. Junci felt, first of all, that heaven was amoral and indifferent. Heaven isn't inherently good. Heaven is, kind of this force that kind of binds the universe together, and it's really, somehow, it's kind of like these questions about human behavior are almost beneath his concern. Added to that, Junci felt that human nature was essentially bad. Right, so the problem isn't about cultivating our natural goodness. It's really about suppressing our bad tendencies, refining our desires and emotions, so we can avoid social conflict. And ultimately, this really can only be done, by the promise of reward or threat of punishment. Right? I mean, you do have education. You have to show people how to behave well. Right, but then you have to reward people when they behave correctly, and if they behave in the wrong manner, they have to be punished. His thinking would be very influential with respect to the development of kind of an offshoot school from Confucianism, legalism. And so he was operating around 300 to 237 BC, so actually before Mencius, right? But eventually these two individuals kind of defined kind of the core elements of this debate about human nature. Finally, we should note the development of a almost kind of completely independent religion in China during this period called Taoism. And we do really need to think about it because eventually it's going to influence many aspects of Chinese society and the further development of Confucianism. So Taoism dates from the 4th century BCE, According to its own tradition, the founders were two fellows named Lao Tzu and Shuangzi. And particularly with these two guys, as far as we know, they might be entirely mythical. We're not really sure. At the heart of Taoism is this idea or concept called the Tao. Has nothing to do with the stock market, spelled differently, D-A-O. Best translation would be the way, right? The Tao is everything, right? It is, a little bit like this concept of heaven that we already talked about within Chinese cosmology, but in some ways kind of more specific, right? It is the source of everything, its creator. It defines the way in which the universe unfolds, its process, the flux of the universe, the fact that it's always in kind of constant change. The best way, I think, to explain the Tao is for anyone familiar with the kind of whole mythology of the Star Wars films, right? The creator of Star Wars, a fellow named George Lucas, he actually borrowed this idea of the Tao, and that became the Force, right? So pretty much everything about the Force, how it's presented, how it operates within the Star Wars universe, exactly like the Tao, right? The thing that kind of binds everything together. If you're in alignment with the Tao, right, then you're kind of in harmony with the universe. You're better able to empathize with not just other people, but with all elements of the universe, living and unliving, and so forth. So the Tao, related to the Tao, the goal is to be in harmony with the Tao, with the rhythm of the universe. Right. Another way to think of it might be if the universe were a river, right? That you're somehow flowing with the current. That might be another way to think about it. In order to achieve this, though, we need to kind of get back to our original state of being, right? We're born in kind of a simple state, right? One way they described it is when you're born, you're like an uncarved block, right? But then over time, in connection with the various kinds of emotions that you experience, the disappointments, the joys, and so forth, we get all these carvings that obscure, that block our original nature, right? A lot of these tied to desire, right? Wanting things, the fulfillment of desire, the denial of desire, and so forth, right? So the idea is to somehow eliminate all these carvings, get back to this kind of pure state of being, right? And then we can be in alignment with the Tao. And that idea, by the way, we're going to see similar ideas developing in other religious and philosophical traditions, again, entirely independently, right? It's not a case of borrowing from Taoism or vice versa. As far as we can tell, this is happening independently in each case. Two other principles we should note in connection with the Tao. One, this kind of idea becomes very important for understanding the nature of the universe. Any action pushed to an extreme will initiate a reaction to the opposite extreme, like a pendulum, right? And with respect, when these ideas kind of influence Confucianism, they kind of think about what this means for good government, and the idea about finding the right balance, like not too much government, not too little government, right? Too much government can be oppressive, and then you get a reaction against it. Which brings us to legalism, right? Kind of initiated by Junzi, the idea that humans are essentially selfish and so forth. And eventually legalism will be adopted by a dynasty, the Qin dynasty, who will succeed in unifying China on the basis of legalism in 221 BCE, right? So, this is, remember, this was during a period, legalism became popular during a period where China has fragmented into a large number of smaller states. Many of them are at war with one another. And so the legalists became concerned with how to end the wars and create a strong state. And again, right, at the core of legalism, the idea, this probably would have made sense during this period of constant warfare, right? Human nature, essentially selfish, right? In order to create a stable society, you need laws and correspondingly punishments that are severe, but also impartial, right? I mean, they have to be administered fairly, right? It can't, there can't be variation based on, that someone is more important than someone else, or that you have the right connections and so on, right? It has to be impartial. And the Qin state, who adopted legalism, were able to unify China on this basis. And a major factor in that is, as they brought territory under their control and were able to create a stable environment, eventually large numbers of farmers, merchants, and so forth would move to territory that they controlled, thus making these territories wealthier, more revenue for the government, thus able to build up a more powerful army, conquer more territory, and so on. So eventually able to reunify China. When we talk about China in general, we'll pick up with the Qin. Right now, I want to move over to developments in India. And as I mentioned, we're not talking about any one religion here, right? This is kind of before we see the development of a number of distinct religious traditions, probably the most important one with respect to India as a whole being Hinduism. And by the way, Hindu originally meant Indian, right? So it kind of reflected the religious and social institutions of India as a whole. And so for a long time, the two terms are almost synonymous in a sense, right? That Hindu basically also designating someone who inhabits India and therefore is kind of part of this kind of societal / religious structure. Today, of course, Indian refers to all inhabitants of India regardless of religious belief, which reflects the fact that eventually other religious traditions are going to enter India and become quite prominent, probably the most important one being Islam. Now, if we talk about Hinduism as a religion, we should note that it features tremendous variation, right? So, India is a huge place. It really is more a continent than a country, kind of on the scale of say, Europe, right? So there are certain shared concepts that apply to Hindus throughout India, but as you move from one community to another, you find tremendous variation, right? So Hinduism doesn't really constitute a single uniform religious community when you get into the details of practice. But again, you have certain concepts that are shared throughout. For instance, transmigration, or what we sometimes call reincarnation, right? The idea that when you die, you are reborn into a new body. The sacredness of the Vedas, right? These kind of earliest texts are going to be held sacred by all Hindus, as are cows. And there are some deities such as Shiva and Vishnu, which pretty much all Hindus, to some degree or other, worship, right? But then there are lesser deities that, with respect to which you find much variation as you move from one place to another. So if we're looking at the development of Hinduism, we kind of have to go back to where we left off with the period of Aryan rule, during which a priestly elite caste evolved. So initially, in terms of, what the religion might signify to people on a deeper level, in terms of their ability to participate in it with respect to ritual and so forth, most people really had very little access to kind of religion at the beginning, right? But then as we look at the Veda, the Vedic texts, right, we see with subsequent texts a movement away from an emphasis on sacrifice and ritual towards spirituality, and corresponding to that, kind of an opening of the faith to larger numbers of people. Right? So if we look, for instance, at the treatises of the Brahmanas, which are some of the earlier texts from 1000 to 800 BCE, it's primarily about ritual and about controlling the sacred power of ritual, right? And the control was in the hands of the Brahmin. And so they were the gatekeepers. And in a way, they will continue to be so. But there was very kind of little direct interaction for most regular folk with religious practice. When we get to the latter Vedas, or Vedic texts, things start to change, right? So the latest texts are the Upanishads. We already talked about them. And the Upanishadic texts, which were produced roughly between 800 and 500 BCE, emphasize power through knowledge rather than ritual, right? So ritual becoming less important in some ways. I mean, it's still important, right? But it's not the end-all and be-all. And there's much more focus on kind of an understanding of, the cosmology or nature of things, right? The nature of reality, the nature of human existence, and then, once you understand the nature of human existence, you can kind of start modifying your practice so as to maximize outcomes, shall we say, right? So probably at the core of what will become Hindu, but also Jainist and Buddhist cosmologies, at the heart of that will be the idea of samsara, the ceaseless cycle of life and death, right? This basic idea of reincarnation, that when you die, you are reborn, and then based on how you behave in that life, again, you'll die and be reborn, but that will determine your fate, right? Whether you have a better or a worse life. And so I think most people are familiar with this basic concept of Hinduism. What a lot of people don't realize, that the objective is to break free of this cycle of life and death, right? I think for many Westerners who are raised in, a monotheistic tradition like Christianity or Judaism, we think, oh, this is great, right? I mean, I'm going to die, I'm going to come back, hopefully into a better situation. But for a Hindu, there's kind of the idea that at some point you really get tired of this, right? And so the objective is immortality, but that doesn't mean what I think many Westerners would imagine. It really is about escaping existence entirely. And ultimately what it means is to kind of negate your sense of self, right? To kind of become one with the universe. And we'll talk more about that in a bit, but this is very different from how we think about the afterlife in the Christian, Judaic, or Islamic conception of heaven and so forth, right? For Hindus, everything is impermanent, right? Even good and evil, right? They really don't mean anything outside of the context of specific episodes of existence. Existence is always about movement and change. It's endless cause and effect, right? And the idea is to kind of get out of this. How do you do this? So it really does involve a better understanding of the nature of things, but also better understanding of who you are. And by who you are, I don't mean like who you are in any particular existence, right? That's not the real you. The one that's connected to your job, even to your family members, to how much money you have, to the things that you like in this particular reality. The real you is something much deeper, right? The soul might be the term we would use in kind of Western religious traditions. The term they use in Hinduism is Atman, right? And you really need to have a deeper understanding of your truer self in order that you can then somehow merge with the ultimate reality of Brahman. Remember, Brahman, we talked briefly about it, is this kind of deeper reality underlying the one that we experience that is in constant flux and change. This deeper reality does not change. It is permanent, right? So the physical world, our bodies, our personalities, all of these are insubstantial, right? They're not real. They're not of substance. They're impermanent. They're eventually going to disappear. Even the gods are impermanent. They will not last forever. Only this deeper reality underlying everything, Brahman, is unchanging. The difficulty is to recognize your real self, right? The one that is not tied to whatever emotion you're experiencing now, the whatever existence you're going through right now. How do you recognize this real self? And once you do that, then you have a better understanding of Brahman, right? This kind of absolute underlying existence, because that really is where your Atman resides, right? You need to kind of disentangle it from this kind of day-to-day mortal existence, right? This kind of cycle of life and death. You need to break free of that. So I know that's, a lot of that is maybe difficult to absorb. So, we'll be discussing that during one of our Zoom meetings in greater depth. Want to make sure we understand that. And, it's one of those things that you really, you probably don't get in the first go fully anyway, right? It's something that, the more you think about it, the more you read about it, the more you talk about it, you start to really get a better sense of it. Now, if we talk about samsara within Hinduism, again, though, we're kind of like, this is like pre-Hinduism. So a lot of these ideas are also relevant to Jainism and Buddhism, right? The two other religious traditions that are going to emerge in India, right? Who also, kind of have similar cosmology with respect to samsara, right? So there are some details that help us understand how to navigate samsara, right? First, probably the most familiar one would be karma, right? For every action, there is an inevitable effect. This cause and effect is what actually kind of drives samsara, right? And so the basic idea, right? If you create good karma, like you behave correctly in this life, you create good karma, then you will have a better life next time around, right? If you create negative karma, right, then you will have a poorer existence next time around. And for most, even for most Hindus who kind of understand, at least in principle, that the ultimate goal is to break free of samsara, it takes a while before you're really in the right place, kind of mentally, psychologically, spiritually, and so forth, to really start thinking about that, right? For most Hindus, right, the immediate objective is to achieve a better life next time around. We call this the ordinary norm, right? Maximizing good actions and minimizing bad actions to achieve the best possible rebirth. And that's pretty straightforward. I think that's not too hard to understand. But at some point, as your soul, your Atman becomes wiser, kind of the accumulation of experiences after you've been in samsara for, Lord knows how many cycles of existence, you're ready for something else, what we call the extraordinary norm. What you're ready for is liberation. The term they use is moksha, from existence, right? To escape, to do this, you need to escape all karmic effect, right? And in order to do that, you kind of have to start, you have to like stop operating in this reality. So it's not even about doing the right thing. In a way, it's more about kind of disconnecting from this reality. And that's really hard, right? I mean, that might mean even in some fashion distancing yourself from loved ones, right? Not having this strong feeling of attachment, a willingness to kind of let them go, right? Again, in kind of more monotheistic religious traditions, very often we imagine that with the afterlife we'll be reunited with loved ones. So it's a very, very different kind of concept, right? And it is something I think that for many people, even many Hindus, it's really hard to get to that point where you're ready for moksha. And just to give one example, there's a very famous musician, a fellow named George Harrison, used to play for a group called the Beatles. You might have heard of them. He became very famous, among other things, for becoming very much fascinated with Hinduism, actively promoting it. And I remember an interview with him where they asked him, like, are you ready for moksha? And he's like, yeah. And he kind of explained, like, I have a son, I have a wife, and, maybe I need to be here a little bit longer for them, but I'm ready to let that go. And it's not that he didn't love his wife or his son, right? But I mean, he's just, kind of arrived at this place where he's ready to take the next step. That next step being moksha, where you cease to exist, right? And that's another idea I think very difficult to wrap our heads around, right? To negate your sense of ego, of individuality, to become that drop of water that falls within the ocean of Brahman. And in a sense, there's still you, but in another sense, there's no longer a you or an I, right? You merge with this larger ocean of existence. Another very important concept connected with the ordinary norm is dharma, the right order of things. And so this is really important because Hindu society, particularly during this period, where Hinduism is just emerging, very hierarchical, very much what is expected of you defined by what caste you belong to, your gender, your family, your wealth situation, what stage of life you're in, and so forth. And so in order for you to create good karma, you have to live your life according to dharma, the right order of things. Dharma basically dictates what is expected of you. Again, based on your sex, class, caste group, stage in life, and various other life circumstances. So to give an example, if based on your dharma, the expectation is that you should be a warrior, but as it turns out, you really don't want to be a warrior, you're really bad at it, maybe you're really good at something else, like baking cakes. It doesn't matter. The basic contention would be better to be a really, really poor warrior, just accept your dharma, than to be really, really successful at baking cakes. And I think for a lot of Americans, this, be like, that just doesn't quite sit well, right? But it's a different kind of society, and from a societal point of view, it actually has some merit. Like, so you end up with as many warriors as you need, and maybe not more bakers than you could possibly find work for, and so forth. There's a bit of an oversimplification, right? But it does carry on, and something about it does work. Now, with respect to the ordinary norm, I should mention one last thing. There is also this idea of paradise, and you might come across it, but paradise is just another stage. It's not moksha. It's not permanent. If you are reborn into paradise and within the ordinary norm, that would be kind of the ultimate goal. But this is not permanent. You won't be there forever. Eventually, you're going to have to re-enter samsara and be reborn into a different situation. Again, the ultimate ambition is moksha. Another term we might use for this is renunciation, right? Basically, to give up your sense of self. And any action, even good action, is counterproductive to escaping samsara. It's more about detachment. Non-action is the only way to withdraw from normal existence, to move beyond the usual responsibilities of family and society, and ultimately demands the absence of ego. Ego being kind of sense of your own individuality, sense of self. You have to let that go. Related to that, you have to let go desires, attachments, and so forth. By the way, any of you familiar with, kind of the whole hippie culture of the 60s, people dropping acid and so forth? That was a big part of it, right? I mean, the idea was with LSD kind of a shortcut to losing your ego. A lot of the music from that period talking about kind of letting go of your ego, letting go of your sense of self, giving up desires and so forth. We're kind of, a lot of what I'm talking about definitely applying to Hinduism, but the development of these ideas, in a sense, kind of predating the emergence of Hinduism as we know it today, and would inform two other religious traditions as well, Jainism and Buddhism, right? And for both of those, they really correspond to a focus on, well, how do you achieve renunciation, right? So teachers emerge, right, initiating the Jain and Buddhist traditions, basically, trying to provide a way for achieving moksha, for renouncing your sense of ego. The Jain tradition, and in fact, the term Jain, it comes from the word jina, right? They often refer to moksha or renunciation as jina. The idea that you achieve victory over samsara. The founder of this tradition is actually named Mahavira, and from what we can tell, he lived between 540 468 BCE. So Jain tradition, as a way of achieving moksha, breaking free of samsara, however you want to put it, jina, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, this is for those individuals who are full on committed to achieving this. They basically start with the idea that, in order to detach yourself, you have to engage in what we call aesthetic practices. Aesthetic means kind of, these very kind of simple ways of living, giving up things, right? And by doing this, you destroy karmic defilement. Certainly bad actions. I mean, they definitely think bad karma, bad actions are worse than good actions, but you really need to break free of both. So if you become a Jain monk and even if you're a Jain layperson, this is pretty serious business. You are bound by 5 vows: not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not even little white lies. I know, so far you're thinking, yeah, I could do that. Not to engage in sexual activity. Okay, now maybe you're thinking, that might give me pause. And not to own anything. And, being that this is America, that last one's probably the hardest. And not being holier than thou, I find that one difficult too, right? We like our stuff. So again, right, you don't find a lot of people who have embraced Jainism, the Jain tradition. Again, this is, and they're not really looking for, kind of large scale conversion. This is really for those who are committed to the end goal, right, of renunciation. Most Jain laypersons, kind of the minimum, you're probably a vegetarian. This ties in with probably, this concept is relevant to all 3 traditions: Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, but probably is most kind of at the forefront with Jainism. And this is the idea of ahimsa, or non-injury, that you should do nothing to harm any other living thing, right? This is paramount because this creates karma, and even to some degree bad karma. So don't eat meat. In a way, even vegetarians are harming living things, but it's considerably on a smaller scale than with sentient beings. If you're eating meat. But if you have Jainists who would even be hesitant to walk on the grass, right? I mean, if you can avoid harming any kind of living thing, like even microorganisms, you should try. So, okay, Jainism not for everyone, and that in a sense creates a market for someone who, maybe is able to present something a little bit more doable for the average person, but who really does want ultimately to achieve renunciation. And that's creating an opening for what will eventually become Buddhism, which centers around a figure known as the Buddha. The Buddha is not his birth name, right? It starts with a guy named Siddhartha Gautama, who eventually becomes the Buddha. The term Buddha meaning enlightened one. And this starts in India, though it is interesting to consider that Buddhism eventually kind of fades out in India, but becomes much more popular in Central Asia, for most of its history in China, and also Southeast Asia. So what about Siddhartha Gautama? Born circa 566 BCE, a prince, came from an incredibly wealthy background, very privileged, grew up in a palace, and so in a sense really, had very little knowledge about the sufferings of the world until at the age of 29, he left the palace and, was quite stunned to see what suffering looked like. People who were ill, people getting old, people dying in poverty, and so forth. And so this kind of got him to thinking about the nature of existence, right? And particularly, how does one break free of samsara, the dilemma of the endless cycle of mortal existence? So according to the tradition, at some point he took up intense yogic meditation under a tree known as it's a Bodhi tree, a type of tree, in a place called Gaya. And one night during his meditation, he realized all his past lives and achieved full enlightenment to become the Buddha. And it was at this point that he fully understood the reality of the cycle of existence and how to stop the karmic outflows that fuel suffering. He came up with what is known as the middle path. And, this is the main point being here is that, it's trying to find a way to achieve renunciation that's actually doable for the vast majority of people. He pledged himself to achieving release for all beings, right? So the middle path is between the extremes of asceticism, kind of like Jainism giving up everything, and indulgence, where you just completely go with your desires, right? And this becomes the core of Buddhist beliefs and practices. And underlying this are what are known as the Four Noble Truths. And this is, in some ways, I think, if you really want to have a good appreciation of Buddhism, The Four Noble Truths are a good starting point. You really need to fully comprehend what these are. So, number one, all life is dukkha or suffering, right? I mean, this is kind of the nature of existence. You might have kind of brief moments where you feel happy, but ultimately, existence at its core is about suffering. Number two, the source of suffering is desire. Uh, this he means all desires, right? Many desires that we would consider, appropriate, acceptable, even in some ways, desiring to get a good job, desiring to get married, desiring to have children. But this is the source of all suffering, because even when you get what you want, and first of all, if you don't get what you want, it's pretty easy to see how that can lead to suffering. But even when you do get what you want, right, this just creates a basis for new desires that very often go unfulfilled, or new worries and concerns. Imagine you desire a new car, but you get the new car, and now you feel happy for a moment, but then now you're worried about how to pay for the insurance, or worried that where to park it, or that someone's going to steal it, or anytime something deteriorates, this becomes a source of suffering and so forth, right? Number three, the cessation of desiring and suffering. If you can give up wanting things, you will no longer suffer, right? So, a lot of people will be like, well, if I only had this thing, I'd be happy. And somebody might, with some justification, respond, well, what if you could, just not want that thing? Somehow train yourself not to want it, and then you'll achieve exactly the same happiness that you felt was contingent upon getting that thing. And a lot of people are going to be like, I'm not buying that, but I mean, this is kind of at the core of Buddhist belief. So finally, number four, the path to the end is eightfold. How do you give up desire, right? How do you, giving up desire, then cease to suffer? And so the path is eightfold. It consists of right understanding, like when you really understand kind of the nature of things, right? I mean, that's the first step. Right thought. And there's kind of this idea that in a way you can practice thinking correctly about these things, right? Like when you start to think, oh, I really want that, remind yourself that you don't need that thing, that your happiness shouldn't depend on it. And if you practice doing that enough, it becomes habit. Right speech, right? Think carefully about what you say, that you're not promoting desire and so forth. Right action, how you behave. Right livelihood, right? That, I mean, they're not rejecting the idea that you need to make a living in order to survive and so forth, and even that you might have a comfortable material existence. And by the way, Buddhism would prove very popular among merchants, people with money. They found that this kind of religious / philosophical system was quite compatible with their way of life. But that shouldn't become the end all and be all of existence. Right effort, right mindfulness, and then finally right concentration. Again, that kind of speaks to the idea that you can train yourself to think, to behave, to feel even correctly about these things. And the ultimate goal, moksha, though in Buddhism the term we usually use is nirvana, not the band from Seattle, but rather this kind of idea of breaking free of existence, right? Disciples focused on the moral eightfold path, which ultimately, if you think about it, is also about empathy, right? Kind of really becoming super aware of how your actions, your behavior, the things you say impact others, to empathize with those around you, to recognize your connection with them. The Buddha himself supposedly attained nirvana when he died in 486 BCE. He was able to effectively, right, through this eightfold path, the middle path, extinguish his karmic bondage, by which he passed from the rounds of existence, right? So this is kind of the, at the core of Buddhist belief. We're going to learn that over time we'll see the emergence of different sects of Buddhism, right, where they develop kind of, this is kind of at the foundation of whatever form Buddhism might take, but then you'll see kind of different sects emerge that have kind of, unique, specific beliefs that only they have, and so forth. But obviously, the Buddha himself is at the center, regardless. We're going to stop here. This is the end of part one. When we come back, we're going to pick up with the development of monotheism.